Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the Rotary Club. My name is James Woods and I'll be introducing you to my colleague Rachel Hussey shortly. We're here today to speak to you about a topic which we consider to be of grave importance. We hope that this presentation will enlighten you and empower you to take action in raising awareness of the issue we discuss. Some of you may or may not know these following facts, but I want you to imagine a hypothetical person. I want you to assume this hypothetical person to only have gained their current knowledge of understanding of pressing issues to our health, safety and overall well-being from the news and politicians. What do you think this person would consider to be the most important issue? What do you personally think is the most important issue today? Terrorism may definitely be one of the more popular answers to this question. You may even yourself consider this to be an issue of grave importance. A study suggests that more than half of Australia's adults are concerned about terrorism and believe the government needs to implement stronger preventative measures. Although slightly increased now, there were only 9 terror-related deaths from 2014 to 2017. Please don't misconstrue what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to downplay the seriousness of terrorism. But what if I told you that on average, one person dies every single week as a result of violence from their partner or former partner in Australia? In other words, one death occurs on average each week as a result of domestic violence. Would you consider this to be a bit more of a pressing issue? I think it is fair to say so. The problem is that the narrative behind terrorism is easily promoted. What I mean by this is that it creates revenue through clickbait articles, and a strong political stance is known to attract voters. Now you may be thinking, why am I talking about terrorism in a speech about domestic violence? To answer your question, context. I want you to understand that domestic violence is a silent killer. Although as of late, domestic violence has been brought more and more into the public conversation, which I believe is a positive step forward. I still don't believe enough of a proactive approach has been taken, however, to prevent such violence, particularly when you see the actions taken against terrorism in comparison. One death a week is a very concerning number, and I believe should be talked about far more to bring it into the public's eye and political spectrum. Justice Lindemeyer and Fogarty put it well in the case of Kennan and Kennan in acknowledging that it was only recently that it be appropriate for the law to intervene into the private sphere of the home relating to such matters. This case was in 1997. This indicates that we may have a cultural issue of sweeping domestic violence under the carpet, so to say. The laws have continuously evolved since the above-mentioned case in a bid to prosecute perpetrators of domestic violence. But it still appears there is a stubborn silence surrounding the issue. How can we solve this issue? How can we take a proactive rather than reactive approach? Now, I want you to hold that thought. Prior to my colleague discussing how we may raise awareness and implement preventative measures on this issue, I think it's important to understand the different ways that domestic violence may be perpetrated and some of the flow-on effects, as well as the true scale of the issue. Death is the ultimate price paid by those subjected to domestic violence. But more often than not, the violence takes place over an extended period of time before someone is killed. Police attend to a domestic violence-related call-out once every 2 minutes. I think this gives you perspective into how serious the violence may be prior to a death occurring, or just the general scale of domestic violence within Australia. Women are the most at risk of physical violence. Now, women and men both experience domestic violence, but 1 in 6 women, in comparison to 1 in 16 men, are subjected to this violence. Emotional abuse, on the other hand, is experienced by 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men. So really, women are the ones who experience the worst of it. One of the more pressing issues of domestic violence is the long-lasting psychological effects of verbal and physical abuse. Consider that in a lot of these cases, the violence, whether it be verbal or physical, has long-lasting effects on the psychological well-being of those exposed to it, and that is the psychological well-being of the victim. Children and other persons exposed to the violence can experience anxiety, depression, increased aggression, antisocial behaviour, suicidal thoughts or tendencies, or suicide, compromised cognitive function, and the list goes on and on and on. So you understand now that death may be the final outcome of the violence, but isn't the sole issue. Domestic violence is a stain, a plague on our functioning society. One example of the flow-on effects of domestic violence is that children may mimic behaviours seen at home, on the school playground, which we know as bullying. We all know the effects that bullying can have on children and could be considered in the same light as domestic violence. Emotional and verbal abuse may well be the starting point of domestic violence and will be delved into more deeply by my colleague. But I want to talk about a particular issue that has seen an evolution of the law to better tackle violence that leads to death. Strangulation has been considered as a specific offence in a domestic violence setting, as well as an aggravating offence. For those of you who don't necessarily understand what an aggravating offence is, it basically means the criminal act attracts significantly larger penalties. This was a recommendation by a task force created by the Queensland Government to see how they may better tackle domestic violence. This has been an important step forward, as strangulation is one of the greatest risk factors of death being likely to occur as a result of the violence. However, these law changes are still largely a reactive rather than proactive approach to the issue. These laws tackle offences once they have occurred. Although more difficult, the government should utilise resources at their disposal to prevent such violence. Preventative measures would likely have to occur at a cultural level. The reason why I say this is because at a statistical level, we may only be seeing the tip of the iceberg. That is, a majority of incidents of domestic violence go unreported. The reasons as to why most cases of domestic violence go unreported are both personal and societal. Personal and societal reasons run from embarrassment, fear of retaliation, imbalance of power, and victim-blaming attitudes. Now, these may be relatively obvious explanations for unreported cases of domestic violence. However, there are often instances where lesser-known types of domestic violence go unreported due to the fact that it is unknown such actions are indeed an act of domestic violence. Now that you have an understanding of the depth and seriousness of the issue, as well as a basic platform of knowledge, Rachel will run through some of the lesser-known types of domestic violence, as well as how we may further create awareness and possibly take a proactive approach. Thank you.
Healthy relationships are built on equality and respect between partners. When one party tries to control the other, it can be extremely harmful. A power imbalance can take many forms. These include physical and sexual abuse, as mentioned by my colleague James, or could further include intimidation, financial abuse, threats, or stalking. This usually results in one partner being extremely frightened of the other and feeling unsafe in the relationship. So, what has been done so far in our society to improve this detrimental issue? In Queensland, there has been action taken to strengthen legislation, police and justice responses to ensure the system deals effectively with domestic violence. With the introduction of a National Domestic Violence Order Scheme, DVOs made from the 25th of November 2017 can be enforced across all states and territories in Australia. The Domestic and Family Violence Death Review Board has also been established to review domestic violence related deaths and recommend systems to prevent future fatalities. Another initiative includes expanding domestic violence duty lawyer services enhancing awareness of court processes among victims and perpetrators, and simplifying the domestic violence order application process. Today, there are more than 300 women refugees around Australia, and there have been many advances in the past 40 years in how we deal with domestic violence. Yet, there is still a long way to go. So, what can we do as a community to raise awareness of domestic violence and provide preventative measures? At the very least, we need to put in place processes that make it easier and safer for women to be leaving these relationships without being hurt or murdered. Leaving a violent partner or home situation is a difficult step for a victim. If a victim does not know where to go or does not feel supported by a service, or worse, if there is no service for the particular need, the victim may return to the violence and not try to leave again. Compassionate, coordinated responses provide much needed support to victims trying to leave and will ensure greater success than disjointed and disengaged services. The importance of an effective service system response cannot be overstated. When working at its best, an integrated service response will save lives. Recent coronial inquests have found that a lack of coordination between services, particularly health and police services, contributed to the deaths of victims in domestic homicide. There are small things we can do to make a future impact. These may include getting to know your neighbours in order to report incidents of domestic violence. We must not consider the abuse just a domestic or not my business. Another thing we may do is hold our relatives and friends accountable for violent and unacceptable behaviour. We must also be networks of safety for our family and friends who have suffered domestic violence. We must provide an environment where victims feel safe and able to seek help to remove themselves from danger. We also need leaders of religions to take a leadership role in encouraging respectful relationships. We also need parents and citizens associations to proactively work to build school communities that model healthy relationships. We also need producers of all kinds of media to take the opportunity to depict domestic violence in ways that create a better understanding of the nature of the problem, as well as ways to best respond to prevent or intervene. There needs to be a light shone on domestic violence. There needs to be awareness around this. We need to talk about what we do when we suspect these situations. We can't turn blind eyes to it. But it's very difficult, as we know, for most of us to say, okay, what can we do as a human being to prevent these situations? The big issue here is masculinity. Men are raised to not express emotions in a healthy way, so there is this physical aggression, which often comes as a result. This is what makes it extremely difficult for women to leave. They often agonise over ways to break up with their partners because they are worried things will get violent. People frequently ask, so if things are that bad, why do they stay? Why don't they just leave? The biggest reason she stays is that she knows she's risking her life and potentially the life of her children if she does choose to leave. All too often, people are making excuses for their partners because they want to assume they are making good choices. So often, when people see these warning signs, the first thing they do is talk themselves out of it. It's a one-time thing, or he doesn't want me to associate with these people because he has my best interests at heart. Those in an abusive relationship were often raised abusive. Abusers don't start abusive. This is a process they go through to get their partners attached before things start to escalate, which is why it is easy to make those excuses. It's building trust first. It may start with a comment of anger and then escalate from there to threats. So how do we change our culture to take the view that domestic violence is unacceptable? When it comes to anything, we live in a culture where we cover things up. And we know as women, you're never really taught how to deal with aggressive behaviour. We hope there is a generational shift away from how children are being raised. Teaching young boys respect for women from the beginning is essential. Most are growing up now knowing that it is not acceptable to hit people when they are angry, or so they are carrying this thought with them in their intimate relationships. There are coping skills we can learn and finding our words to control our anger instead of resorting to physical aggression. We talk about the cycle repeating itself, especially the cycle of violence and abuse. Yet with the current generation of parents, there is more awareness surrounding unfavoured opinions regarding how their parents raised them with violence. For example, there are things that their parents physically did which they would now actively make sure they don't do to their children. This is a more positive generational shift, and we are seeing this in society today. So, if you think terrorism is a bigger threat to our society, think again. Thank you.